Hi, this is Paul. Earlier, I released a video called What is Sanity? Collective Relevance Realization. And as I said in the video, it was fairly chaotic. I had about 20 minutes in order to do something, and I wanted to put something out given, watching some of Kanye. Yay. Why would you bring your name down to yay? Now, in terms of a nickname, and so thanks for all the corrections on that, by the way. But this question, what is sanity, is a really big one. And in terms of collective relevance realization, this is a very interesting idea for me right now. Now, MJ, who's been a critical but quite an interesting commenter for the last little while. Started out his or her. MJ, you should write me an email. Maybe we should have a conversation online. It'd probably be kind of fun. I don't know if you. I always assumed MJ was a him. Somebody else said no, MJ's a her. I don't really know. MJ doesn't tell me a whole lot, and I can't really see those tiny little pictures. In relation to your channel, I can honestly say that I've been having a difficult time keeping my sanity and trying to find some sort of continuity in your thought processes. That's totally understandable. It actually generated a pretty big back and forth. So then I put a rather meaty comment beneath it, and I said, yes, the channel is ADHD. More so probably because the channel doesn't have included in it the sort of natural processes that make up my life. This morning I did email, then I set up tables and chairs for the ladies' coffee break, Bible study, then I listened to the pastoral concerns of a number of women, conversed with them on spiritual and practical matters, and in a few minutes I had to go to pastor's lunch with colleagues in the area. I won't mention any of the fancy words that I do on my channel. They won't be understood at some point today. If I get a minute, I might sit down and continue to chew on collective relevance realization. That's sort of what's been getting at me, which is one of a dozen such issues I'm thinking about at any given time, because a lot of the videos that I've made in the past are still very much with me, and I want to continue them, and I want to continue chewing on them. And I've got always about 10 video projects in mind for every one that comes out, and the one that comes out is sort of at the top of the salience horse race in terms of my consciousness Congress. So yeah, I get that. This is hard to follow in terms of where's Paul going? I don't know. It's pretty messy and chaotic. And someone a little bit later here talked about me being messy, and that's right. If you would come to my office, you would see a big mess. I'll keep reading it. This, along with cleaning out junk of the church, I've been cleaning out junk because I have to really clean out my office. I need to really clean out my office. And so I'm moving. In order to do that, I'm making space in other places in church, and I'm getting rid of stuff, and I'm moving things. I mean, today I spent most of my day. I did a couple of Rando's conversations, and I've been working on sermons, and I have to build a new PC, and because the PC that I work with in my office isn't really set up for what I've been doing for the last 4 years. And so at this point, it's like time to buckle down and clean up the office and have something that is more streamlined for what I want to do. And I've always built my own desktop PCs. And so, I'm going to build a desktop PC that is actually a little bit better suited for what I've been using a PC for, and instead I've just been using this notebook computer that this is the second notebook computer that I sort of modified to have enough storage and make things work for me. See how ADHD I am? I can't even stick to my own conversation. All this along with cleaning out junk from the church, managing all sorts of things at church and in the community, managing a family and a marriage, thinking about my sermon and Sunday school class on Sunday. I keep forgetting that I got to teach that on Sunday. Thinking about our estuary kickoff on Thursday night, that's coming, and more. What you get on the channel is a particular slice of myopic mental meanderings, as John Van Donk likes to call it. That anyone who watches at all is sometimes beyond me. But don't confuse the part for the whole. I am far more complex than my thoughts or ideas that flow out of these. In other words, you get sort of an ADHD myopic mental meandering snapshot, and especially if the video is like 20 minutes, I just don't have time, and I want to sit down and I want to do something, and have a little bit more time today. I'm not under a lot of time pressure, but I don't have a lot of time. So what is sanity? And I've been thinking a lot. I've thought a lot over many years now about sanity. Because part of what I do as a pastor is I talk to people, and a lot of the people I talk to have diagnoses. Some of them are on disability, and disability for mental health issues. And so right from the start in this church, I got sort of thrown into the deep end of that. And again, I am not a psychologist or a psychiatrist or any of those things, yet I have to live and help facilitate community with many of these people. Now, as is often the case, I get some of my best video recommendations from some of you, and oh shoot, are my sound levels too low? Nuts. Now I gotta check that. See, all this stuff. Okay, so you're gonna have to adjust your sound a little bit because they're up a little bit higher now. Sorry about that. But whenever I do randos conversations and I'm on Zoom for a while, Zoom monkeys with levels in the computer, and if I don't check them before I start using OBS, now I make these videos, then suddenly my sound levels are too low. I mean, it's just the world of complexity that I manage that, you know, I'm not complaining. I like to manage it. I like what I'm doing. I do this for fun. If I didn't find this so fun and helpful for my own sanity and my psyche, I would stop. But I do like it. And so one of you, I won't mention him because he and I actually did a randos conversation. He didn't want it published. So if he didn't want his randos conversation published, he certainly wouldn't want his name. He sent me this video from Lex Fridman 274, Karl Deisseroth. I bought the book. It's you know, if I got an addiction, it's book buying. I bought the book, and so far the book is interesting. You know, I've been reading Oliver Sacks and Yalom, we'll forget his last name. And I've been reading these psychology books lately, and that's been helpful in terms of lots of things. So, you know, Nathan complained that, you know, we're using words we don't understand. Well, I'll tell you, if there's anything, if there are any words that have sort of become magic words and power words in America over the last 50 years, they're definitely psychology words. As I talk to parishioners, they regularly use technical psychological terms to describe things in their lives which may or may not have any relationship to at least my layman's understanding of those psychological words. Language is a wild thing. It doesn't stay contained. It breaks out, and it's a living thing. And there it goes. But there was some stuff in this conversation that was very good, especially when it gets down to sanity. Now, I made this video a little while ago, The Strange Business of Seeing, where I talked about the twins and Oliver Sacks and the man who mistook his wife for a hat. And the video did better than it would. Some of you sometimes, you know, complain about some of the clickbaity titles, but the truth is that some of you need a little clickbait to get you up, to get the finger moving. Okay. And so I want to at least have titles. The purpose of a title and a thumbnail is to at least attract some attention. I try to stay faithful to the video. But in the Oliver Sacks book, he talks about these twins that sort of had this interesting number capacity, that they were on TV, they had these, you know, they were able to do these calendar things, and they had this prime number things, and he talked about it in the book, and it talked about how they were living in these psychiatric institutions, and then, you know, the idea was that they had to be mainstreamed. And so what happened to these twins is that they were basically sent out in the world to do these menial janitorial jobs. They were separated from each other because the people who were responsible for them very quickly saw that unless you separated them from each other, they would never give up their beautiful little number game that gave them so much joy. And so that's what they did. And I'm tempted to drop some of that video into this video because it's just a crushing story. But this is where my thoughts about collective relevance realization really land, because many of our ideas, not all, many of our ideas have everything to do with understandings of what is good, right, and true. And so in the care of these twins, the powers that be decided that it was in their best interest to no longer have their little communion of two of numbers and to split them up so they could work crappy janitorial jobs and ride the bus and live lives of poverty and of misery divorced from each other. That was an upgrade. Why? So they could participate in society. In other words, and then thinking about Kanye, who, yeah, some of the things he says really make you wonder, but if you think about him all the way, there's just a lot going on there. I did a conversation with Adam Friended. It was on Think Club. It could have been this one, Is God Real? And one of the arguments that Adam put forward is that basically the Second World War was a test of, he didn't use these words, and I wasn't using these words then, but in a sense, the collective relevance realization of these different civilizations and their approaches. That the West won because the West's system was truer. And in a lot of ways, Jordan Peterson's ideas, very Darwinian ideas about truth and the way we know truth are similar. The way you know something is true is that in the very long term it wins. Now, that's not a dumb idea and it's not a bad idea. Now, obviously, if you're a Christian, it's not the only idea, because there's, for Christians, a referent outside of nature that, in fact, is the final and fullest measure of truth. The best part of this conversation was right at the end. And if you bailed out like after 20 minutes, I totally understand, because that's what I did. And then with some encouragement from some of you, I finished it all the way to the end. And sort of at the end, you get the best parts.
That's what you said, Barnaby Rogerson. On the point of prophecies, even people like Edward Gibbons, they agree that the prophecies of the Quran.
Now, Edward Gibbons is a very interesting guy for these guys to quote. I don't know how much they know about Edward Gibbons, but what fascinated me towards the end of this conversation is just how modernist these particular Muslims had become in terms of their argumentation. They sounded like all the atheist Christian apologetics debates of a decade ago. Someone had pointed that out in the comments section, and when I went back through it, I thought, yeah, he's right. It's very much like that. And then it gets to this point.
Quran had been met.
So I have to ask.
Yeah.
So I don't understand the question exactly.
He wants to know if you'll convert to Islam.
No, I'm.
And Jonathan Peugeot, who's been Jordan's faithful, patient wingman through this whole miserable conversation. And it's not a lovely conversation. I don't know who you should talk to with respect to Islam, but not this guy. This is his second try with this dude, and it was just as much as a mess as the first time.
Saying that. No, that wasn't.
I mean, that's the question. So look, I would say to some degree.
Jonathan's like, I've been sitting here the whole time watching this stuff. Isn't it obvious what is happening here?
It's not up to me.
No, but my question was, just to remind you, the question was, if I gave you evidence that would satisfy a certain level of probabilistic.
No.
So you wouldn't.
No, because that isn't how I evaluate the situation.
How would you evaluate that? This is the crux.
Well, I'm a Muslim enough to have been invited to your mosque.
No, you're always invited. Even if
Nobody, Sam Harris, you're really a Christian. No, I'm not. I'm Muslim enough to be invited here. No, you're not. Anybody can come here. Nobody gets what Jordan is saying whenever he uses that argument.
No, but I mean this specifically.
Yeah,
I mean this very specifically, you know. I don't think in some sense, it's a very complicated problem.
okay.
You know, when people
And nobody likes when Jordan says that either.
meet me on the street, they'll say things like, I met a couple of Orthodox Jews in New York, and they said to me on the street that they call me rabbi, which was it's a hell of a thing to hear, you know. And so, and then I have Muslim people who are listening to my biblical lectures, and
More than that,
they say,
by the way. Yeah.
yes, and more than that. And, you know, they say, well, Peterson doesn't know it yet, but he's really a Muslim. And
Just like Sam Harris is really a Christian.
that's very, that's an honor, you know? Just like it was an honor to be approached by these Orthodox Jews. And that hasn't only happened once. And I've had lots of correspondence with people. And the same thing has happened with the Orthodox Christians, and to some degree the Catholics, and lesser so the Protestants. But
My video that I made that Matt Dilla or Jordan Peterson is a Protestant, just like Matt Dillahunty is a Christian, just got demonetized because I used a clip from Martin Luther King Jr. in it. But no, Jordan, you're very Protestant in many ways.
And so I don't know exactly what to make of that. We talked about this a little bit.
Yeah.
And let's talk about proof, you know. Well, for me, the proof of faith is the attractiveness of its adherents. And that's something to think about, right? Well, are you a shining example of the Muslim faith? Well, how hard do you shine?
And the video ends right there. So then I think, oh, this must be, you know, Daily Wire cut this off as a cliffhanger. So then, of course, I had to pull out that crappy Daily Wire app and open that thing up and looked at, oh, it seems to be about the same length. I go all the way to the end, and that one ends there too. And it's like, did the camera run out of battery? Is this an intentional thing? What happened? Anyway, Darwinian truth. Part of Peterson's point, similar to Adam Friended, is that in some ways you can't evaluate the part without seeing how it contributes to the whole. Now, sometimes we don't want to evaluate the part because sort of modernistic, scientistic thinking usually only wants to evaluate the part at the exclusion of the whole. But this idea is basically that in some ways, true sanity will express itself long term. Now, remember, number one, Gospel of Mark, Jesus' mother and brothers wanted to go take a hold of him because they thought he was mad. This was probably after the public, just after his public ministry started. How's this going? Many people, Jesus is doing this by the power of Beelzebub. I mean, all those elements are in the gospel story, but Jesus today, given all of what he said and did, Tom Holland's point that, we'll take down the Daily Wire commercial. Tom Holland's point that, Jesus is the most effective short storyteller in all of human history. The gospel writers had to write something that was relevant for their day, relevant across the world horizontally, relevant vertically through time, and 4 people pulled that off, and they managed to do it, and what they have in common is all about the same person, and that was Jesus. So, was Jesus sane? Because you read some of the stuff Jesus says, and it's like, unless you hate your father and mother, unless you eat my body and drink my blood. I mean, in a certain way, sanity has everything to do with collective relevance realization. And the reason we sort of fix on each other, I was just thinking this morning after a few phone calls from people who, this is very common as a pastor, they're upset at the world, they're upset at people around them, they're upset at their spouse, they're upset by something or another, and they just need to vent and get it off their chest. And do you ever sit down and wonder why? They need to know they're not crazy. And the way we know we're not crazy is we find someone and we talk to them. A lot of the Randall's conversations that I have, and I've seen this in myself, I've seen this in others, a lot of what we do when we want to, especially if we get a screeing, that's a being of light on a screen, a screeing. I used it on one of my other thumbnails. Especially when we get a chance, is we just talk and we look for their approval. Well, why do we look for their approval? Because we want to know if we're sane. And now we say, oh, but mental illness is medicalized. Yeah, to a degree, but it's on a spectrum. And this question about sanity and crazy is actually a really huge thing. One of Jordan Peterson's longtime collaborators and grad students, I had a conversation with him. It would probably be good to have him on the channel and talk about this, because he was actually studying this very specific thing. Because it makes a context makes an enormous difference. This is from Tim Keller's book Preaching, and I've taken some of his ideas over the years and expanded them. There are many severe problems with the sovereign self. I talk about the quest for the sacred secret self as a philosophy of life. To begin with, it assumes that we know what we want, that our inner desires are coherent and harmonious. Modernity tells you to discover your deepest desires and fulfill them, but our deepest desires often contradict one another. A desire for a stellar career will often be in conflict with a desire for a particular relationship, and our feelings constantly shift, so an identity based on our feelings will be unstable and incoherent. Even more serious is that an identity based on expressing ourselves without listening to outside dictates is actually an illusion. And this is where we get at this idea of sanity, and sanity as collective relevance realization. What is most sane? What must I do? How must I act? We check with each other, and we base who we are and what we should do basically on everyone around us. And this is why, again, it's really important to give people in other parts of time a say in who we are and what we do, because otherwise we're just sort of trapped and imprisoned by the horizontal. A popular exponent of the sovereign self is Gail Sheehy in books like Seminal Passages in 1976. She insists that you can become yourself only when you look inside and express yourself apart from any external evaluations or accreditations. That's a very common idea. This is patently impossible. Imagine an Anglo-Saxon warrior in Britain in AD 800. He has two very strong inner impulses and feelings. One is aggression. He loves to smash and kill people when they show him disrespect. Living in a shame and honor culture with its warrior ethic, he will identify with that feeling. He will say to himself, "That's me. That's who I am. I will express that." The other feeling he senses is same-sex attraction. So you have this gay Anglo-Saxon warrior. To that he will say, "That's not me. I will control and suppress that impulse." Now imagine a young man walking around Manhattan today. He has two inward impulses, both equally strong, both difficult to control. What will he say? He will look at the aggression and think, "That's not who I want to be," and he will seek deliverance in therapy and anger management programs. He will look at his sexual desire, however, and conclude, "That's who I am. That's the real me. That's my true self." What does this thought experiment show us? Primarily, it reveals that we do not get our identity simply from within. Rather, we receive some interpretive moral grid, lay it down over our various feelings and impulses, and sift through them. This grid helps us decide which feelings are me and which should be expressed, and which are not and which should not be. So this grid of interpretive beliefs, not an innate, unadulterated expression of our feelings, is what shapes our identity. Despite protest to the contrary, we instinctively know our inner depth is insufficient to guide us. We need some standard rule from outside of us to help us sort out the warring impulses of the inner life. And where do our Anglo-Saxon warrior and our modern Manhattan mind get their grids? From their cultures, their communities, their heroic story. They get it from what's around them. They work off their mappings. They are actually not simply choosing to be themselves. They are filtering their feelings, jettisoning some and embracing others. They are choosing to be themselves in their culture. Their cultures tell them to be. In the end, an identity is based on our own inner feelings is impossible. We need something from someone outside to say we are of great worth. And the greater the worth of the person telling us, the more powerful that recognition is in our identity formation. And he goes on from there. And so we very much find sanity from each other. And that, of course, leads to the NPC, the non-player character dynamic. And this is especially true in the young, because Jordan Peterson mentioned one time, and actually my mother said a very similar thing. She says, when people get older, they get more so. I said, what do you mean? So they're like themselves, they just get more so. And basically that means that we differentiate as we get older. Our mappings get different. And that's why you find, high school students are all trying to be individuals and they look all like each other. They're just NPCing. They're just being non-player characters because, and then even in their rebellion, they're trying to do that like everyone else. And so we're always checking with one another. And then when we come to this word sanity, things get really complex.
Is there a clear line between dysfunction and function, disorder and order?
This is always debated in psychiatry, probably more so than any other, medical specialty. I'm a psychiatrist. I treat patients.
Now, part of the reason this has to be is because, again, science really is striving for a monarchical vision. They want to see the world as it is. They want their answers to questions to be eternal. And so changes through time, because we are sort of always checking with each other through time, this is going to make things vary.
Patients still, I see acutely ill people who come to the emergency room where there's no doubt that this is not something that's working well, where the manifestation of disease is so powerful, where the person is suffering so greatly, where they cannot continue as they are. But of course, it's a spectrum, and there are people who are closer to the realm of being able to work okay in their jobs, but suffer from some small dysfunction, and everywhere in between. In psychiatry, we're careful to say we don't call it a disease or a disorder unless there's a disruption in social or occupational functioning.
Okay, right there. We don't call it a disease or disorder unless there's a disruption in social occupational functioning. Now, that functioning, of course, has everything to do with what society suggests is functional. Now, again, you might wave this away and say, oh, you're just like the postmodernists. No, because it also has to hit the ground. It also has to hit the lower register. It also has to hit the physical world. There are all these checks all the way up and down. And I can decide I'm Shirley Temple on the good ship Lollipop, but my 6'4", 59-year-old frame ain't gonna cut it. I don't have locks of blonde curls. There's the physical layer is important. And we're all living in this there are all of these layers, upper and lower register, and we're in the midst of them. And what we're calling disease is something that is violating the standards that, at least at this point, we have all sort of agreed upon, at least within our cultural space. Now, again, as we all know, these things vary widely from culture to culture. We have the gay Anglo-Saxon warrior and the gay young Manhattan man, and in Tim Keller's book Preaching, and these contexts matter.
But of course, psychiatry has a long way to go in terms of developing quantitative tests. We don't have blood draws. We don't have imaging studies that we can use to diagnose.
You can't draw Ye's blood and say whether or not he's crazy. Most people who are just saying that are playing armchair psychologists, looking at him. He's saying things they don't like, say he's crazy. But hey, I listen to him, and there's some of the things that he's saying, and it's like, if I were visiting him as his pastor, I would listen very carefully to what he had to say. Are these things wise that you're saying? Are they helping you? Now, they certainly seem to be helping his career in some ways, perhaps. I really don't know, but there's no blood draw for this. And if an NPC 150 years ago on the other side of the world were to sort of be teleported here and tell all of us what he really thought, we might say he's crazy.
And so that line ultimately that you're asking about between order and disorder, function and dysfunction, it's operational of the moment. How are things working?
Can we just linger on the terms for a second? So this disease, dysfunction.
Now it's helpful to remember that, again, talking about taking loan words, the beginning of AA, for example, Alcoholics Anonymous, part of the move that they made was we're going to, in a sense, medicalize alcoholism to destigmatize it. And that was a really important move that they made. Difficulty is that, the definition of addiction, and again, I really like Vervaeke's in terms of agency. Is this giving you more agency or less agency? So then when you look at Kanye, you have to ask, are his perspectives giving him more agency or less agency? But that's not the only test. You have to ask whether or not that agency is moving towards shalom. What do I mean by shalom? Shalom is this Hebrew word of goodness and peace and well-being and the world the way it's supposed to be. The problem, of course, is that we're not at all clear on the way the world is supposed to be. Chesterton made that point. It's a lot easier to say no pain rather than pain. Oh, okay, good one. Low-hanging fruit. No poverty rather than poverty. There again, low-hanging fruit. And when you listen to people and their descriptions of goodness in the world, it's usually the contradiction of negative things. But that itself is not a mapping or a picture or a portrait of shalom. And in fact, okay, let's take a context like Nazi Germany. Someone who would say, no, let's not have these work camps and gas Jews and Slavs and all kinds of people that we imagine are undesirable. Let's not do that. You're crazy, they would say. So what is sane? It's really hard. Shall we medicalize it? And I think part of why this gets medicalized very quickly is because then it puts it into the realm of hallowed science. And we can't seem to assess this and figure that and winnow this out in terms of our religious moral categories. So let's make it all about science.
How careful should we be using those words? Can we just, even in this conversation, from a sort of technical perspective, but also a human perspective, how quick should we be in saying that schizophrenia, depression, autism, as we kind of go down this across the spectrum of different maladies, just to use the word dysfunction and disease?
I would say to give ourselves license to capture the whole spectrum, let's say disorder, because that captures truly.
Now that's really interesting because chaos and order. But of course, Mussolini's Italy, the trains ran on time. That's order. So I don't know that his order-disorder is really going to cut it because, of course, obsessive-compulsive disorder is a disorder of order.
I think the essence of it, which is we need to talk about it when it's not working, when there's disorder, and that's the fairest and
again, not working. And often as a pastor, there's a situation where there's some conflict or there's something isn't going right in somebody's life or in somebody's relationship, and you sit down and you can sort of do the Dr. Phil thing and say, how's that working for you? And that's actually not a bad way to approach a lot of things, but at the same time, I see some situations, let's say, okay, now I'm going to start using these words that I'm not really licensed to use, like codependence, like a severely codependent relationship. And it's like, well, it's kind of working for everyone, and they're sort of sticking to it because it's working for them right now. But usually you can see that this isn't going to work once one of these little pieces falls out, but it's working for them now, so off they go. And again, this judgment call of whether or not something is working is, of course, set up against a template of something ideal, an ideal life that should be pursued. And so that's how we're sort of deciding whether or not something is working or not working.
Most inclusive term to use.
So is it fair to assume that basically every member of the human species suffers from a large number of disorders then?
Well,
and we just have to pick which ones are debilitating and for each person.
Now again, he's sort of having this individual medical assessment. When I go to my doctor and I sit there in that little room and he, looks at my blood work or listens to my heart or does something like this, in many ways, he doesn't know. He would get a lot more coming to my house and looking in the cupboards. Well, what are you eating? Well, how many people are living here? Well, is the house clean? And, as a pastor, you still make house calls because I'll tell you, in a lot of cases where someone's on the phone talking about this and that and this and that and this and that, go to the house. The house will tell you a lot.
If you look at the numbers, there are, if you look at how our mental health disorders are currently defined, you can look at population prevalence values for all these disorders, and you can come up with estimates that somebody will have a lifetime prevalence of having a psychiatric disorder that approaches 25% or so. And so that,
wow, that's a big number.
And in some studies it could be more, some studies it could be less. Now, what do we do with that number? What does that mean? And in some ways, that's the essence of what I was hoping to approach with the book, is to reflect on this spectrum that exists for all the disorders. There is, and taking nothing away from the severity and the suffering that...
You see those little buttons there? Why is his collar disordered? He's got buttons. It should be buttoned down. Is that, or maybe it's style to leave them up. I don't know. Is my attention to that an order or a disorder?
It comes at order to approach with the book is to reflect on this spectrum that exists for all the disorders. There is, and taking nothing away from the severity and the suffering that comes at the extreme end of these illnesses, but nearly every one of them exists on a spectrum of severity, from nearly functional to completely dysfunctional, life-threatening, and even fatal. And so that number, 25%, more or less, it doesn't capture that spectrum of severity.
And of course, you might, well, again, let's look at Jesus. His actions led to his crucifixion by the Romans. And, when you read the biblical accounts, it certainly looks like something he could have avoided. So was his, it's a massive messianic complex. I don't know if the messianic complex is in the DSM or not. I don't have a copy. But again, this is tremendously slippery stuff. And in theory, in practice, it can be too. Although, again, many of the people I talk to have diagnoses sufficient so that they are on American government paid disability. But at the same time, what I'll also notice is sometimes some of these people have insights which just blow you away, because it's like, wow, that's true. And someone with a diagnosis and a disability can probably see that more clearly than someone who is sitting in this chair. Lex actually makes a comment like that a little bit later on.
Looking at that number, where do those numbers come from? Is it self-report? Is it people who show up and say, I need help?
Because there's no blood draw.
Is it somebody else that points out that person needs help? Or is it like estimates that even go beyond that for people who don't ask for help but are suffering quietly alone?
When you look at self-report numbers, then those numbers get even higher, beyond 25% or more. The most rigorous studies are done with structured psychiatric interviews where people who are trained in eliciting symptoms carefully do complete psychiatric inventories of individuals. And these are time-consuming, laborious studies that are not often repeated. When they're done, they're done well. But very often you'll see a report of something in the news of a very high number for some disorder or symptom, and very often, if it's shockingly high, that's coming from a self-report of a person. And so that's another issue that we have. Again, take nothing away from the severity and reality and biological nature of these disorders, which are very genetic, very, we understand.
Now, wait a minute. You just said you couldn't get them a blood draw. How are they biological? Now, I'm not denying or doubting that many of them are, but I think that sounds like his worldview sort of peeking through. I mean, a big reason why a lot of this psychological nomenclature escaped out of the therapist's office and the psychologist's laboratory is because it's powerful, and we're embedded in a worldview that says basically all of these things are emergent from the brain, when, again, you can look at the Oliver Sacks book, you can look at the Yalom book. A lot of this has to do with the relationships that are going on at home and the relationships with other people, and whether or not this is matching the society. Because, a lot of these things seem to be at some level contagious, and we don't mean that viruses are passing them. Relationships are passing them along from one person to another.
And that these are very biological, and yet we lack right now the lab tests and the blood draws to make the diagnoses.
We'll talk about it, just how biological they are, because that too is a mystery. I mean, in terms of from a perspective of how to probe into the disease, how to understand.
My mother-in-law was named Jeanette, and I used to talk about genetics in terms of the way that my mother-in-law would teach things to my wife. And for some people, it's squared. And I'd say things like, well, she's your daughter squared. She not only got your genetics, you also raised her. And one way or another, you mapped the mapping. The child is just an incessant mapper. You mapped all this stuff onto you. So not only does she have your biological inheritance, she also has she was also raised by you. And so she gets a double dose of either the blessings or the curses that you laid down for her. Now, there's a lot more in here than I have time to sort of get into, but...
Is autism? What do we know about autism?
Human beings exist on a spectrum of how social we can be, and this is pretty interesting, actually, scientifically, but also very important clinically. There are hypersocial states where people are almost too social. There are chromosomal deletion states where people have instant affinity and bonding and rich, deep, seeming connections with people, very verbal. On the other end, people with autism spectrum disorder are not able to keep up with social interactions, and it's a spectrum. Some have mild to moderate difficulties. They may have inability to understand what the next thing to do in a social situation is, but may have perfectly good language abilities. And as you progress further along the spectrum, that gets more and more severe, so they can't make eye contact because it's too overwhelming to think about what has to be done next if a person looks in a particular way.
Yeah.
And then as you go farther, then language and social communication themselves break down, so there's no reciprocity, there's no shared enjoyment. And this gets very hard then as you get to this far end of the spectrum where there's really an absence of social cognition at all and social bonding. So why does this exist? What is it? It's very genetic. As I mentioned, it's one of the top 3 or 4 most biological, in the sense of most genetically determined of the psychiatric illnesses. It does have these interesting positive correlations, slight positive correlations with intelligence and education. And the reason for that is kind of interesting to think about. Is there something good about it? Just like, or at least with at least part of the spectrum, is there something good about it? Just as we were talking about for depression, as you could say for mania, as you could say for schizophrenia. And here it's kind of interesting to think about the underlying science of what it means to be good at a social interaction. Someone who's very good at a social interaction is incredibly good at dealing with unpredictable information.
This part really caught my attention. Someone who's very good at social action is very good at dealing with unpredictable information. I mean, and why is my channel so ADHD? I think I'm pretty good at dealing with unpredictable situations, because in my work and in my life, it's a lot of what I deal with. And
social interaction is incredibly good at dealing with unpredictable information, is able to handle this torrent of information coming through, rapidly changing model of the other person and of the interaction, and their model of you.
And you just think about that. Just the way he laid that out right there just begins to give you a sense of, oh my goodness, there's so much going on. In one of the randos conversations I had today, I talked about how a lot of what's happening, because one of the things that's in the conversation right now is the need for an on-ramp for this little corner of the internet. And I gave him the image of, like a plane taking off in Afghanistan or Vietnam at the end of the war. And, people are like, trying to grab other people up, but it's a moving target. And a big part of what's going on here is that we've come to the realization that a tree is not just a tree, and it's obviously a tree, and there it's a tree. No, somehow we see the leaves and the branches and the bark and all of this, and we just say tree. And there's tons of stuff that goes into us just being able to say tree. And in many ways, that's beneath Vervaeke and Peugeot and Peterson's work. If you look at what sort of holds this together, it's the recognition that observation and seeing the world is not such a simple thing. And what he did right there was just show you that, well, as many have said, we don't bump into anything as complex as other human beings, any concrete physical things as complex as other human beings. And of course, we're far more than just what's contained by our skin, and that when we're actually having an interaction with another human being, this is an enormously complex thing.
Unpredictable. Someone who's very good at a social interaction is incredibly good at dealing with unpredictable information, is able to handle this torrent of information coming through, rapidly changing model of the other person and of the interaction, and their model of you, your model of them. With each word that changes, with each new bit of information that comes in through the conversation, each bit of body language, all this is rapidly changing. And some people are able to keep up with that fire hose of information perfectly well. But that's a special brain state to be in. That's working with unpredictability. That's the only way that can be done is most likely by constantly running models of what the other person might be about to say. So you can't stop and think, oh, what did that word mean? What did that shift in?
And so, on Twitter, Peterson was trending again, and basically it was a lot of people mocking him for when in that hijab interview he basically said, "What do you believe in God? What do you mean by do? What do you mean by you? What do you mean by believe? What do you mean by God?" That within all these things, there are nested things. And here in this little corner of the internet, when he says that, we're all like, yeah, there's a lot to that. Just like seeing the tree, or, for Jonathan Peugeot, the glass. And there's a lot going on there. And so then when you look at what it takes to do a good conversation with someone, you begin to realize, wow, there's a ton of stuff going on. But fortunately, all of that stuff is going on sort of behind the scenes in my Consciousness Congress. And when I'm having a conversation, that Consciousness Congress is a flurry of activity, but the, whatever, and it really isn't an individual like a homunculus, but, a little subcommittee is managing the conversation while everyone in back is feeding them models and trying things. And of course, that's not, I couldn't manage it if I was actually sitting in a chair and had a staff of people behind me putting paper in front of me. It's all gets fed into me like feelings and intuitions and instincts. And I've done this before, and oh, that didn't work, and other things. And, all of it, just these massive models. And if you're socially good and relationally good, now again, you might not be seen as a mental giant, and I know people who aren't necessarily seen as very brilliant, but if they're really good socially in terms of interaction, you have to say, yeah, they got skills, they got smarts. It's a really impressive thing.
I constantly brain state to be in. That's working with unpredictability. That's the only way that can be done is most likely by constantly running models of what the other person might be about to say. So you can't stop and think, oh, what did that word mean? What did that shift in eye contact mean? What do they mean together? There has to be some advanced work going on where you're predicting what's going on if you're to keep up with a rich and fast social interaction. Now, on the flip side, there are brain states that maybe don't have to work so fast, but that are extremely important still. Dealing with something that's not moving or that's predictable, still complex, like mathematical proof or a very complex arrangement of geometrical shapes.
And this is where you get back to the twins who couldn't manage anything, but they could come out with prime numbers together, and they somehow did it sort of as a joint hive mind, which is why they had to be separated, because otherwise when they're together, it's like, the little crappy little cartoon with the Wonder Twins, and the twins come together and prime numbers come flowing out of them. But manage a conversation with another human being, manage a job in which there's social interaction, manage all of these things. I often see that sometimes they give, pretty significantly disabled people janitorial jobs, and it's like a janitorial job in and of itself is not a simple thing. Jordan Peterson has that great story about the guy who had to fold letters into envelopes.
A large number of individual non-moving things. There's possibly a way of being that's particularly good at dealing with these static, unmoving, or predictable situations, and less so with these rapidly changing social situations. And so the way I conceptualize autism is these are people whose brains are not so good with the high bit rate, unpredictable information, but maybe quite good at, given enough time, given the grace to work with the system, to look at it from different angles, to take different perspectives with a confidence that it's not changing in between perspectives. That's a brain state that's valuable. It's something that is probably...
Okay, valuable. Oh, now we've got value into this here. So again, the twins together, not valuable. Well, at least once they've sort of been on TV and, the public had sort of gawked at them in a, or gave them wonder, or however you want to conceptualize it. But now, no, we've got to separate them. We've got to send them their different ways.
Has contributed to a lot of the success of the human family, being able to design something, being able to consider all the different...
The success of the human family. Well, there's a value-laden conceptualization, isn't there?
Contributions to a static, predictable system.
So autism, in a sense, is a spectrum that has identifiable characteristics about the way people deal with dynamic information, often expressed itself as like social.
That's right.
Dynamic information.
But your use of the word often there is really, I think, smart, because it's not just social interaction that is a challenge in autism. And so many people conceptualize it purely as a social dysfunction disorder. But it's really any unpredictable information that's a problem, that's a challenge for people on the spectrum. They react very negatively to unexpected sounds, even if not social sounds, unexpected lights, unexpected touches. And so it's really unpredictable information that is, in my view, the core problem with the processing in autism, not just social. Social just shows up because it's so unpredictable.
Yeah, it's
That's just fascinating.
so interesting. I mean, I tried to not to think about that stuff. I'm afraid of thinking about disorders and things like that because just like I don't like sort of economics or game theory, I want to be careful with it because whenever you have a category or a model, it's too easy to just, for everything. I mean, it's the OCD thing. I like models too much. I like categories too much. The moment you acknowledge to yourself, well, I have an eating disorder, for example, or something like that, as opposed to just being well, I'll just leave it at that for my own critical understanding of myself. Let's just say I don't know how to moderate eating fruit. People make fun of me. They think all fruit is healthy. I know. I don't know how to moderate anything, but even
Aired before.
Prologue. Look, there he is, Igagai, the spirit. Yes, I can see him. He's threatening us. Everybody, come see Igagai. Quickly, he is on the beach. I roused from my deep sleep, not sure if I was dreaming or hearing this conversation. It was 6:30 on a Saturday morning in August, the dry season of 1980. The sun was shining, but not yet too hot. A breeze was blowing up from the Mai River in front of my modest hut in a clearing on the bank. I opened my eyes and saw the palm thatch above me, its original yellow grain from years of dust and soot. My dwelling was flanked by two smaller pitaha huts of similar construction, where lived Ahwabisi, Pohoibehe, and their families. Mornings among the pitahas, so many mornings, I picked up the faint smell of smoke drifting from their cook fires, and the warmth of the Brazilian sun on my face, its rays softened by my mosquito net. Children were usually laughing, chasing one another, or noisily crying to nurse, the sounds reverberating through the village. Dogs were barking. Often when I first opened my eyes groggily coming out of a dream, a pitaha child, or sometimes even an adult, would be staring at me from between the paishuba palm slats that served as a siding for my large hut. This morning was different. I was now completely conscious, awakened by the noise and shouts of pitahas. I sat up and looked around. A crowd was gathering about 20 feet from my bed on the high bank of the Mai, and all were energetically gesticulating and yelling. Everyone was focused on the beach just across the river from my house. I got out of bed to get a better look, and because there was no way to sleep through the noise. I picked my gym shorts off the floor and checked to make sure that there were no tarantulas, scorpions, centipedes, or other undesirables in them. Putting them on, I slipped into my flip-flops and headed out the door. The pitahas were loosely bunched on the riverbank just to the right of my house. Their excitement was growing. I could see mothers running down the path, their infants trying to hold breasts in their mouths. The women wore the same sleeveless, collarless, mid-length dresses they worked and slept in, stained a dark brown from dirt and smoke. The men wore gym shorts or loincloths. None of the men were carrying their bows and arrows. That was a relief. Prepubescent children were naked, their skin leathery from exposure to the elements. The babies' bottoms were calloused from scooting across the ground, a mode of locomotion that for some reason they prefer to crawling. Everyone was streaked from ashes and dust accumulated by sleeping and sitting on the ground near the fire. It was still around 72 degrees, though humid, far below the 100-degree plus heat of midday. I was rubbing the sleep from my eyes. I turned to Kohoi, my principal language teacher, and asked, "What's up?" He was standing to my right, his strong, brown, lean body tense from what he was looking at. "Don't you see him over there?" he asked impatiently. "Igagai, one of the beings that lives above the clouds, is standing on the beach yelling at us, telling us he will kill us if we go to the jungle."
Okay. Everybody in the town recognizes this being. Everybody in the town sees this being. Why can't the author of this book, Daniel Everett?
"Where?" I asked. "I don't see him." "Right there," Kohoi snapped, looking intently toward the middle of the apparently empty beach. "In the jungle behind the beach?" "No, there on the beach. Look," he replied with exasperation. In the jungle with the pitahas, I regularly failed to see wildlife they saw. My inexperienced eyes just weren't able to see as theirs did. But this was different. Even I could tell that there was nothing on that white sandy beach no more than 100 yards away. And yet, as certain as I was about this, the pitahas were equally certain that there was something there. Maybe there had been something there that I just missed seeing, but they insisted that what they were seeing, Igagay, was still there. Everyone continued to look toward the beach. I heard Christine, my 6-year-old daughter, at my side. What are they looking at, Daddy? I don't know. I can't see anything.
Now, put these two stories together. What's going on? Now, obviously, with Dr. P, he had a capacity to see which he lost. Everybody within this culture, he described the dress, he described the difference that the children, the pre-walking locomotion, the children scoot instead of crawl. And all of this, all these differences we kind of look at, like, yeah. But this seeing, nobody's going to accuse the village of lying. Nobody in the village is having an hallucination. What is going on?
Chris stood on her toes and peered across the river, then at me, then at the Pitahas. She was as puzzled as I was. Christine and I left the Pitahas and walked back to our house. What had I just witnessed? Over the more than 2 decades since that summer morning, I have tried to come to grips with the significance of how two cultures, my European-based culture and the Pitahas culture, could see reality so differently. I could never have proved to the Pitahas that the beach was empty, nor could they have convinced me that there was anything, much less a spirit, on it.
Now, Dr. Sachs, in a way, had some ways of sort of, okay, smell. Oh, it's a rose. And he breaks into song, because song is sort of the means by which he connects to the reality. Place it on. Oh, it's a glove. You probably have a glove song.
As a scientist, objectivity is one of my most deeply held values.
Objectivity. Well, what exactly do you mean by objectivity? Is there a chair in the room? The Pitaha, I don't know if they have chairs. Could they see a chair? Or if they walked into a room, what would they see? Now, maybe if they saw me sitting in a chair, they would get a sense of it. I remember the missionary story in the Dominican Republic. We had a mission office in the capital city, and sometimes people would come from the countryside. Again, this is Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic, not a very big island. But you would let's say go into the bathroom, and you would see footprints on the toilet seat. Well, why on earth would there be footprints on a toilet seat? I've just traveled all throughout the Pacific Northwest and into Canada, and in all sorts of bathrooms here and there. Not once have I seen footprints on a toilet seat. Why not? Because a toilet is not something you stand on, because when you see it, you know exactly what it is for, and in fact, your whole body responds to all of these things. I remember when one of my cousins was young, and I was with my father and with my cousin, and it's kind of a funny story. We were at a campground because we were camping together. My father, not very good with children, left him to babysit my son, and came back and he tried to change his diaper. In the years that my father was raised, he never had to cook for himself or wash his own clothing. Those things were not lost on my growing up years, however. And so, then now in the care of my young cousin, who was at that point still in diapers, which my father didn't realize, the toddler basically made a point that pointed to the bathroom. Father thought, well, maybe he wants to go to the bathroom. Brings him right into the bathroom, and the first thing he does is, quite a quick little kid, puts his hands right in the middle of the urinal. And then my father realizes he's wearing a diaper, and my father had been fooled. And the rest of the family got a good laugh at that. But what did the toddler see in the bathroom? What do we see when we walk in a place? What can we see? What is there and what is not there? I listen to conversations about all sorts of things that are abstract in our culture, and in fact, we don't know what we're doing, because we're all trying to see and talk about things which are there or are not there.
If we could just try harder, I once thought, surely we could each see the world as others see it and learn to respect one another's views more readily. But as I learned from the Pitahas, our expectations, our culture, and our experiences can render even perceptions of the environment nearly incommensurable cross-culturally.
Now, what's interesting is that we're always seeing certain things that are not there, and we're talking about things that are not there. Where is classical liberalism? Where is wokeness? Where is Christianity? Where is cognitive science? Where is, but yeah, we handle all of these things, and in some ways we see all these things in a certain degree like we see a chair.
The Pitahas say different things when they leave my hut at night on their way to bed. Sometimes they just say, "I'm going." But frequently they use the expression that, though surprising at first, has become one of my favorite ways of saying good night. Don't sleep, there are snakes. The Pitahas say this for two reasons. First, they believe that by sleeping less, they can harden themselves, a value they all share. Second, they know that danger is all around them in the jungle, and that sleeping soundly can leave one defenseless from attack by any of the numerous predators around the village. The Pitahas laugh and talk a good part of the night. They don't sleep much at one time. Rarely have I heard the village completely quiet at night or noticed someone sleeping for several hours straight. I have learned so much from the Pitahas over the years, but this is perhaps my favorite lesson. Sure, life is hard and there is plenty of danger, and it might make us lose some sleep from time to time, but enjoy it. Life goes on. I went to the Pitahas when I was 20.
Even life. This word that we see life, we think, although we get fooled sometimes. And we're not at all sure we can define what on earth we mean by that word, but there it is, and there we see, and there we do, and here we are.
26 years old. Now I'm old enough to receive senior discounts. I gave them my youth. I have contracted malaria many times. I remember several occasions on which the Pitahas or others threatened my life. I have carried more heavy boxes, bags, and barrels on my back through the jungle than I care to remember.
Now remember his story. He goes in there as a Christian missionary and he loses his faith.
But my grandchildren all know the Pitahas. My children are who they are in part because of the Pitahas. And I can look at some of those old men, old like me, who once threatened to kill me and recognize some of the dearest friends I have ever had, men who would now risk their lives for me. This book is about the lessons I have learned over 3 decades of studying and living with the Pitahas, a time in which I have tried my best to comprehend how they see, understand, and talk about the world, and to transmit these lessons to my scientific colleagues.
Okay, but here's the funny thing. It's kind of the same as the AI robot thing. Can you transmit what you learn to your other colleagues if they don't live in the village? Now, again, it's been interesting in this little corner of the internet. That is in many ways the point of postmodernity, is that, well, you don't have that lived experience. But do we have analogs? Do we have words? I mean, in some ways, the lived experience argument sort of wants to put everybody in a little bubble, but then, of course, if we're all in little bubbles, there's no point in talking to one another, and so you can, spare me the tirades or the manifestos or all of those things, because, of course, my lived experience is not yours, and to what degree do we not share them, and what levers are you going to use to open up our little bubbles, and what kind of imperialist are you, anyway, in bursting my bubble? Is that moral? Is that valid? Is that right?
This journey has taken me to many places of astounding beauty, and into many situations I would rather not have entered.
And think of that, beauty. Is beauty a thing that we see, but we know it? We certainly all use the word and have a sense that we're all on the same page when we're talking about it.
But I am so glad that I made the journey. It has given me precious and valuable insights into the nature of life, language, and thought that could not have been learned in any other way.
Yet he writes a book. But he's right in both counts, both to write the book and that I will never know the Pitaha like he does. I can read his book, I can learn a few things, I can even use it in a video to make an application with another book. But here we are.
The Pitahas have shown me that there is dignity and deep satisfaction in facing life and death without the comfort of heaven or the fear of hell, and in sailing toward the great abyss with a smile. I have learned these.
But now we see a little bit of his new faith, doesn't he? And he didn't get that from the Pitaha. He never saw the God on the beach. So what faith did he seize? What faith did he grasp at? What faith did he exchange for the one that he came to the jungle, the one that brought him to the Pitaha with?
These things from the Pitahas, and I will be grateful to them as long as I live.
Let's jump to another story.
The twins. When I first met the twins, John and Michael, in 1966 in a state hospital, they were already well known. They had been on radio and television, and made the subject of detailed scientific and popular reports. They had even, I suspected, found their way into science fiction, a little fictionalized, but essentially as portrayed in the accounts that had been published. The twins, who were then 26 years old, had been in institutions since the age of 7, variously diagnosed as autistic, psychotic, or severely retarded.
Well, one of the things that comes through beautifully in his end of the book, where it talks about the simple, is what Paul Kingsnorth talks about in terms of the machine. That in fact, the world, this great network that we call civilization that has encompassed the globe since it first began to encompass the globe in 1492 with, as Charles Mann calls, the Columbian Exchange, is a system of reality, a system of being, a system of relating. It's, in fact, a system of seeing and valuing that we all must participate in. And there are those who, for one reason or another, cannot participate in it. And part of what's beautiful about the book is, in fact, the heart he has, that he wishes that the system, the machine, would value some of these strange, simple persons, and it does not. There's no place for them.
Most of the accounts concluded that, as idiot savants go, there was nothing much to them, except for the remarkable documentary memories of the tiniest visual details of their own experience, and their use of an unconscious calendrical algorithm that enabled them to say at once on what day of the week a date far in the past or future would fall. This is the view taken by Stephen Smith in his comprehensive and imaginative book, The Great Mental Calculators. There have been, to my knowledge, no further studies of the twins since the mid-60s, the brief interest they aroused being quenched by the apparent solution of the problems they presented. But this, I believe, is a misapprehension, perhaps a natural enough one in view of the stereotyped approach, the fixed format of questions, the concentration on one task or another with which the original investigators approached the twins, and by which they reduced them, their psychology, their methods, their lives, almost to nothing. The reality is far stranger, far more complex, far less explicable than any of these studies suggest. But it is not even to be glimpsed by aggressive formal testing or the usual 60 minutes-like interviewing of the twins. Not that any of these studies or TV performances is wrong. They are quite reasonable, often informative as far as they go, but they confine themselves to the obvious and testable surface, and do not go to the depths, do not even hint or perhaps guess that there are depths below. One indeed gets no hint of any depths unless one ceases to test the twins, to regard them as subjects. One must lay aside the urge to limit and test and get to know the twins, observe them, openly, quietly, without presuppositions, but with a full and sympathetic phenomenological openness, as they live and think and interact quietly, pursuing their own lives spontaneously in their singular way.
Now this is where you get his, where he's trying to get, obviously, at the limitations of the scientific approach. And he does that quite vividly in other parts of the book, where he basically is saying that, I mean, the approach by which doctors are using or pursuing deficits. And in fact, in the second section of the book, he notes that if there are deficits, there are also excesses. And in these excesses, you discover some unusual things as well. I'm looking for a better picture of the twins that I had found before.
Then one finds there is something exceedingly mysterious at work, powers and depths of a perhaps fundamental sort, which I have not been able to solve in the 18 years that I have known them. They are, indeed, unprepossessing at first encounter, a sort of Tweedledum and Tweedledee, indistinguishable mirror images, identical in face, in body movements, in personality, in mind, identical too in their stigmata of brain and tissue damage. They are undersized, with disturbing disproportions in head and hands, high-arched palates, high-arched feet, monotonous squeaky voices, a variety of peculiar tics and mannerisms, and a very high degenerative myopia, requiring glasses so thick that their eyes seem distorted, giving them the appearance of absurd little professors, peering and pointing with a misplaced, obsessed, and absurd concentration. And this impression is fortified as soon as one quizzes them, or allows them, as they are apt to do, like pantomime puppets, to start spontaneously on one of their routines. This is the picture that has been presented in published articles, and on stage. They tend to be featured in the annual show in the hospital I work in, and in their not infrequent and rather embarrassing appearances on TV. The facts under these circumstances are established to monotony. The twins say, "Give us a date any time in the last or next 40,000 years." You give them a date, and almost instantly they tell you what day of the week it would be. "Another date," they cry, and the performance is repeated. They will also tell you the date of Easter during the same period of 80,000 years. One may observe, though this is not usually mentioned in the reports, that their eyes move and fix in a peculiar way as they do this, as if they were unrolling or scrutinizing an inner landscape, a mental calendar. They have the look of seeing, of intense visualization, although it has been concluded that what is involved is pure calculation. Their memory for digits is remarkable and possibly unlimited. They will repeat a number of 3 digits, of 30 digits, of 300 digits with equal ease. This too has been attributed to a method. But when one comes to test their ability to calculate, the typical forte of arithmetical prodigies and mental calculators, they do astonishingly badly as their IQs of 60 might lead one to think. They cannot do simple addition or subtraction with any accuracy, and cannot even comprehend what multiplication or division means. What is this? Calculators who cannot calculate, and lack even the most rudimentary powers of arithmetic? And yet, they are called calendar calculators. And it has been inferred and accepted on next to no grounds that what is involved is not memory at all, but the use of an unconscious algorithm for calendar calculations. When one recollects how even Carl Friedrich Gauss, at once one of the greatest of mathematicians, and of calculators too, had the utmost difficulty in working out an algorithm for the date of Easter, it is scarcely credible that these twins, incapable of even the simplest arithmetical methods, could have inferred, worked out, and be using such an algorithm.
Now it's important to remember that they have to have an understanding of course, Easter, part of the reason that Easter is so difficult to calculate is because it's one of these ancient days that is dependent on Passover and on a lunar calendar, not on a solar calendar. And for that reason, Easter, just jumps all over the calendar all the time. And to then have an algorithm that can, easily calculate Easter just as such is remarkably difficult. That's the point. But they've also got to have the understanding of Easter in order to do this. Because if I were to ask you to calculate, such and such lunar day that is in some obscure tribe in a place that you've never been, well, you wouldn't have the concept for that tribe.
A great many calculators, it is true, do have a large repertoire of methods and algorithms they have worked out for themselves, and perhaps this predisposed W.A. Horowitz and others to conclude this was true of the twins too. Stephen Smith, taking these early studies at face value, comments, "Something mysterious, though commonplace, is operating here. The mysterious human ability to form unconscious algorithms on the basis of examples. If this were the beginning and end of it, they might indeed be seen as commonplace and not mysterious at all. For the computing of algorithms, which can be done well by machine, is essentially mechanical and comes into the spheres of problems but not mysteries."
Now, in this book, he often gets into the difference between the mechanical and the iconic, which very much comes to the fore in this little story.
And yet, even in some of their performances, their tricks, there is a quality that takes one aback. They can tell one the weather and the events of any day in their lives, any day from about their 4th year on. Their way of talking, well conveyed by Robert Silverberg in his portrayal of the character Melangio, is at once childlike, detailed, without emotion. Give them a date, and their eyes roll for a moment and then fixate, and in a flat, monotonous voice they tell you of the weather, the bare political events they would have heard of, and the events of their own lives. This last often including the painful or poignant anguish of childhood, the contempt, the jeers, the mortifications they endured, but all delivered in an even and unvarying tone, without the least hint of any personal inflection or emotion.
Now, bear in mind, they have a IQ of 60. It's quite low.
Here clearly one is dealing with memories that seem of a documentary kind, in which there is no personal reference, no personal relation, no living center, whatever. It might be said that personal involvement, emotion, has been edited out of these memories, in the sort of defensive way one may observe in obsessive or schizoid types, and the twins must certainly be considered obsessive and schizoid. But it could be said equally, and indeed more plausibly, that memories of this kind never had any personal character, For this indeed is a cardinal characteristic of eidetic memory such as this. But what needs to be stressed, and this is insufficiently remarked on by their studiers, though perfectly obvious to a naive listener prepared to be amazed, is the magnitude of the twins' memory. Its apparently limitless, if childish and commonplace, extent. And with this, the way in which memories are retrieved. And if you ask them how they can hold so much in their minds, a 300-figure digit, or the trillion events of 4 decades, they say very simply, we see it. And seeing, visualizing of extraordinary intensity, limitless range, and perfect fidelity seems to be the key to this.
They see it. Anyway, say, well, where is it that you see it? Why do you use that word? They could not see the missionary, Daniel Everett, could not see the God on the beach. The man could not see his wife. He could hear her. He could bring her to reality via song, but he could not see her, apprehend her in that way. And these two see numbers.
It seems a native physiological capacity of their minds, in a way which has some analogies to that of which A.R. Luria's famous patient, described in The Mind of a Mnemonist, saw, though perhaps the twins lack the rich synesthesia and conscious organization of the mnemonist's memories. But there is no doubt, in my mind at least, that there is available to the twins a prodigious panorama, a sort of landscape or physiognomy of all they have ever heard or seen or thought or done, and that in the blink of an eye, externally obvious as a brief rolling and fixation of the eyes, they are able, with the mind's eye, to retrieve and see nearly anything that lies in this vast landscape. Such powers of memory are most uncommon, but they are hardly unique. We know little or nothing about why the twins or anyone else have them. Is there then anything in the twins that is of deeper interest, as I have been hinting? I believe there is. It is recorded of Sir Herbert Oakley, the 19th century Edinburgh professor of music, that once taken to a farm, he heard a pig squeak and instantly cried G sharp. Someone ran to the piano, and G sharp it was. My own first sight of the natural powers and natural mode of the twins came in a similar spontaneous and, I could not help feeling, rather comic manner. A box of matches on the table fell and discharged its contents on the floor. 111, they both cried simultaneously. And then, in a murmur, John said, 37. Michael repeated this. John said it a third time and stopped. I counted the matches. It took me some time. And there were 111. How could you count the matches so quickly? I asked. We didn't count, they said. We saw the 111. Similar tales are told of Zacharias Daze, the number prodigy, who would instantly call out 183 or 79 if a pile of peas was poured out, and indicate as best he could, he was also a dullard, that he did not count the peas, but just saw their number as a whole in a flash. And why did you murmur 37 and repeat it 3 times? I asked the twins. They said in unison, 37, 37, 37, 111.
Now notice 37, 37, 37, 111. You saw a chair in there, probably many of you, perhaps most of you. 3 37s is 111. Now, if you had asked me, what are 3 37s? It's 21, 90, 111. That's the way I would do it. 3 30s, 90. 3 7s, 21. 90 plus 21, 111. I would calculate it. We've already showed that they can't calculate, but they're seeing these things. What's going on? What is it with seeing and not seeing, whether it's a god on the beach, or whether it's a wife or a hat, or a foot, or a glove, or a rose?
And this, if possible, I found even more puzzling. That they should see 111, 111-ness in a flash was extraordinary, but perhaps no more extraordinary than Oakley's G sharp, a sort of absolute pitch, so to speak, for numbers.
But now pay attention here too, because the fallen box of matches, they are seeing matches as distinct from the floor. They are seeing matches as outside the box. They are seeing all of those things, all of that framework, all of that chairness, all of that matchness, all of that boxness, all of that is part of what they are seeing.
But they had then gone on to factor the number 111 without having any method, without even knowing in the ordinary way what factors meant. Had I not already observed that they were incapable of the simplest calculations and didn't understand or seem to understand what multiplication or division was? Yet now, spontaneously, they had divided a compound number into 3 equal parts. "How did you work that out?" I said, rather hotly. They indicated as best they could in poor, insufficient terms, but perhaps there are no words to correspond to such things, that they did not work it out, but just saw it in a flash. John.
Now again, they're seeing things. Now you might say, well, what was the God on the beach or not? Was the foot the shoe? But they're seeing things, but they're seeing in a very different way. Strangely, they're still seeing, but what is the seeing about?
John made a gesture with 2 outstretched fingers and his thumb, which seemed to suggest that they had spontaneously trisected the number, or that it came apart of its own accord into these 3 equal parts by a sort of spontaneous numerical fission. They seemed surprised at my surprise, as if I were somehow blind, and John's gesture conveyed an extraordinary sense of immediate felt reality. Is it possible, I said to myself, that they can somehow see the properties, not in a conceptual abstract way, but as qualities, felt, sensuous, in some immediate concrete way? And not simply isolated qualities, like 111ness, but qualities of relationship? Perhaps in somewhat the same way as Sir Herbert Oakley might have said a third or a fifth. I had already come to feel, through their seeing events and dates, that they could hold in their minds, did hold, an immense mnemonic tapestry, a vast or possibly infinite landscape in which everything could be seen, either isolated or in relation. It was isolation rather than a sense of relation that was chiefly exhibited when they unfurled their implacable, haphazard documentary. But might not such prodigious powers of visualization, powers essentially concrete and quite distinct from conceptualization, might not such powers give them the potential of seeing relations, formal relations, relations of form, arbitrary or significant? If they could...
Now, again, arbitrary or significant. What is the distinction between those? Because if, in fact, you're in a classroom and you want to know how to factor 111, seeing comes very usefully. If you want to teach the children how to factor, they're of absolutely no help at all. But what is arbitrary and what is significant?
See 111ness at a glance, if they could see an entire constellation of numbers, might they not also see at a glance, see, recognize, relate, and compare in an entirely sensual and non-intellectual way, enormously complex formations and constellations of numbers?
Now, almost all of the political, religious, theological debates that we are so deeply admired in are all about seeing.
We are in the midst of a culture war.
That's an interesting thing to see. I've been reading this trilogy about the war in the Pacific, and there are bombs, and there are bunkers, and there are ships, and there are aircraft carriers, and there are dead, and there is Iwo Jima, and there are atomic bombs. There are all of these things. Well, that's a war. Well, we're in a culture war. Well, what on earth is that? Well, that was those words were coined. Was it James Davidson Hunter who coined those words? I don't remember. It could have been.
Although it started in the universities, particularly in France, through the open portal of the damnable Yale, and then into the rest of the institutes of higher education, it is not only the faculty and administrators of our colleges and universities who are at fault. Those charged with the privilege and responsibility of running the corporate world are lining up to kowtow at the DIE altar. Diversity, inclusivity, and equity.
Now, notice all the seeing we're doing. We're seeing all over the place. We simply swim in it. Even if you can't, well, does Uncle Sam exist? Well, I see him at the courthouse. I see him at the monuments in Washington, D.C. I see him on the Civil War uniforms that say us, or is it us, or is it U.S.? I see. We live in a world of seeing all sorts of things, and we think nothing of it, and yet we have very limited grasp on exactly how we see and what we see and what's going on in this strange world.
A ridiculous, even disabling power. I thought of Borges's Funes. We, at one glance, can perceive 3 glasses on a table. Funes, all the leaves and tendrils and fruit that make up a grapevine. A circle drawn on a blackboard, a right angle, a lozenge.
A chair.
All these are forms we can fully and intuitively grasp. Ireneo could do the same with the...
And of course, Dr. P, well, that's exactly what he was struggling with. Maybe if you sang a grape song, he would see it. If he smelled the flower, he would see it. Or maybe he never sees it at all.
Stormy mane of a pony with a herd of cattle on a hill. I don't know how many stars he could see in the sky. Could the twins, who seemed to have a peculiar passion and grasp of numbers, could these twins, who had seen 111 nests at a glance, perhaps see in their minds a numerical vine, with all the number leaves, number tendrils, number fruit that made it up? A strange, perhaps absurd, almost impossible thought, but what they had already shown me was so strange as to be almost beyond comprehension. And it was, for all I knew, the merest hint of what they might do. I thought about the matter, but it hardly bore thinking about. And then I forgot it. Forgot it until a second spontaneous scene, a magical scene, which I blundered into completely.
I love how this story unfolds. I have this thought. I mean, that's so, I can see that in myself. So I have this thought, I have this idea. Wow, but then you get distracted, and then you get busy, and then suddenly something else happens.
By chance. This second time, they were seated in a corner together, with a mysterious secret smile on their faces, a smile I had never seen before, enjoying the strange pleasure and peace they now seemed to have. I crept up quietly so as not to disturb them. They seemed to be locked in a singular, purely numerical converse. John would say a number, a 6-figure number. Michael would catch the number, nod, smile, and seem to savor it. Then he, in turn, would say another 6-figure number, and now it was John who received and appreciated it richly. They looked at first like 2 connoisseurs, wine tasting, sharing rare tastes, rare appreciations. I sat still, unseen by them, mesmerized, bewildered. What were they doing? What on earth was going on? I could make nothing of it. It was perhaps a sort of game, but it had a gravity and an intensity, a sort of serene and meditative and almost holy intensity, which I had never seen in any ordinary game before, and which I certainly had never seen before in the usually agitated and distracted twins. I contented myself with noting down the numbers they uttered.
Now, note they're usually agitated and distracted. Well, what does that mean? Well, distracted. Distraction. Tell me what distraction is. Isn't it a difference of focus and attention? Well, what should focus and attention be upon? Well, it's relevance realization, right? And one of the things I was thinking about in my hours of driving and listening to audiobooks and a little bit of relevance realization, I was explaining some of these things that I talk about in my videos to my wife, who watches none of my videos, nor would she care to. You know, the telotic nature of relevance realization. Things are relevant as to their telos, as to their meaning, as to their end, as to their purpose. There's a reason all those things come together. They're agitated and distracted. Well, now they're not agitated and distracted. They're focused on, for them, is their joy, is what they see as glory.
The numbers that manifestly gave them such delight, and which they contemplated, savored, shared in communion.
I love the words used. Contemplated, savored, shared in communion. It's practically religious.
Had the numbers any meaning, I wondered on the way home? Had they any real or universal sense, or, if any at all, a merely whimsical or private sense, like the secret and silly languages brothers and sisters sometimes work out for themselves? And as I drove home, I thought of Luria's twins, Lyosha and Yura, brain-damaged, speech-damaged, identical twins, and how they would play and prattle with each other in a primitive, babble-like language of their own. John and Michael were not even using words or half-words, simply throwing numbers at each other. Were these Borgesian or Funesian numbers? Mere numeric vines or pony manes or constellations, private number forms, a sort of number argot, known to the twins alone? As soon as I got home, I pulled out tables of powers, factors, logarithms, and primes, mementos and relics of an odd, isolated period in my own childhood, when I too was something of a number brooder, a number seer, and had a peculiar passion for numbers. I already had a hunch, and now I confirmed it. All the numbers, the six-figure numbers, which the twins had exchanged were primes. That is, numbers that could be evenly divided by no other whole number than itself, or one.
And it's amazing here because these twins haven't been to school. I don't know at what age I learned about prime numbers. I don't know at what age I paid any attention to prime numbers at all. Probably only at the, at least initially, only at the insistence of a teacher.
They somehow seen or possessed such a book as mine? Or were they, in some unimaginable way, themselves seeing primes in somewhat the same way as they had seen 111ness or 3737ness? Certainly they could not be calculating them. They could calculate nothing. I returned to the ward the next day, carrying the precious book of primes with me. I again found them closeted in their numerical communion, but this time, without saying anything, I quietly joined them. They were taken aback at first, but when I made no interruption, they resumed their game of six-figure primes. After a few minutes, I decided to join in and ventured a number, an 8-figure prime. They both turned towards me, then suddenly became still, with a look of intense concentration and perhaps wonder on their faces. There was a long pause, the longest I'd ever known them to make. It must have lasted a half-minute or more, and then suddenly, simultaneously, they both broke into smiles.
They've arrived at communion. They are worshiping.
They had, after some unimaginable internal process of testing, suddenly seen my own 8-digit number as a prime. And this was manifestly a great joy, a double joy to them. First because I had introduced a delightful new plaything, a prime of an order they had never previously encountered, and secondly because it was evident that I had seen what they were doing, that I liked it, that I admired it, and that I could join in myself. They drew apart slightly, making room for me. A new number playmate, a third in their world. Then John, who always took the lead, thought for a very long time. It must have been at least 5 minutes, though I dared not move and scarcely breathed, and brought out a 9-figure number. And after a similar time, his twin, Michael, responded with a similar one. And then I, in my turn, after a surreptitious look in my book, added my own rather dishonest contribution, a 10-figure prime I found in my book. There was again, and for even longer, a wondering still silence, and then John, after a prodigious internal contemplation, brought out a 12-figure number. I had no way of checking this and could not respond because my own book, which as far as I knew was unique of its kind, did not go beyond 10-figure primes.
Because who would want to? Unless it was your religion, unless it was your God, unless it was your worship.
But Michael was up to it, though it took him 5 minutes, and an hour later the twins were swapping 20-figure primes. At least I assumed this was so, for I had no way of checking it. Nor was there an easy way in 1966, unless one had the use of a sophisticated computer. And even then, it would have been difficult. For whether one uses Eratosthenes' sieve or any other algorithm, there is no simple method of calculating primes. There is no simple method for primes of this order, and yet the twins were doing it. Again I thought of Daza, whom I had read of years before in F.W.H. Myers's enchanting 1903 book, Human Personality. We know that Daza, perhaps the most successful of such prodigies, was singularly devoid of mathematical grasp. Yet he, in 12 years, made tables of factors and prime numbers for the 7th and nearly the whole of the 8th million, a task which few men could have accomplished without mechanical aid in an ordinary lifetime. He may thus be ranked, Myers concludes, as the only man who has ever done valuable service to mathematics without being able to cross the ass's bridge.
Okay. Valuable service to mathematics.
What is not made clear by Myers, and perhaps was not clear, is whether Daza had any method for the tables he made up, or whether, as hinted in his simple number-seeing experiments, he somehow saw these great primes as apparently the twins did. As I observed them quietly, this was easy to do because I had an office on the ward where the twins were housed, I observed them in countless other sorts of number games or number communion. the nature of which I could not ascertain or even guess at.
Number communion.
But it seems likely or certain that they are dealing with real properties or qualities, for the arbitrary, such as random numbers, gives them no pleasure or scarcely any at all. It is clear that they must have sense in their numbers, in the same way perhaps as a musician must have harmony. Indeed, I find myself comparing them to musicians, or to Martin, also retarded, who found in the serene and magnificent architectonics of Bach a sensible manifestation of the ultimate harmony and
That's from a previous story.
order of the world, wholly inaccessible to him conceptually because of his intellectual limitations. Whoever is harmonically composed, writes Sir Thomas Browne, delights in harmony and a profound contemplation of the first composer. There is something in it of divinity more than the ear discovers. It is an hieroglyphical and shadowed lesson of the whole world, a sensible fit of that harmony which intellectually sounds in the ears of God. The soul is harmonical, and hath its nearest sympathy unto music. Richard Wollheim, in The Thread of Life, makes an absolute distinction between calculations and what he calls iconic mental states. And he anticipates...
Okay, he's gonna go through this. I wanted you to get the sense of seeing, and now maybe I'll give you a sense of the machine and where this story goes, and it's not a happy place.
He speaks here of a synthetic perception which transcends analysis and is the unanalyzable essence of all musical sense. He compares such tones to faces.
He goes off into music and comparing it to math and a little bit of that, and we'll get to where I'm going in a minute.
And speculates that we may recognize them in somewhat the same personal way. In brief, he half suggests that musical tones, and certainly tunes, are in fact faces for the ear, and are recognized, felt, immediately as persons or personities, a recognition involving warmth, emotion, personal relation. Particularly fascinating and fundamental problems are raised by the perception and recognition of faces, for there is much evidence that we recognize faces, at least familiar faces, directly, and not by any process of piecemeal analysis or aggregation.
One thing and then ask you a couple more things. So this Izzot distinction is even more peculiar when you look deep into the neuroscience of perception. Okay, so one of the most influential books I ever read was An Ecological Approach to Visual Perception. And it's a classic text on perception and a very sophisticated one, and I don't think it has no pretensions to mysticism of any sort. And so that's kind of interesting given the conclusion. And the conclusion of the author is that what we see aren't facts or objects. We see meanings. So for example,
Now think about that with respect to Dr. P. Think about that with respect to the village and the God and what the missionary cannot see. Think about that with respect to the twins and 111 and prime numbers. They're seeing meaning.
6-month-old who crawls towards a visual cliff, which is a plate of glass stretched over or placed over a falling off place. The 6-month-old will stop. He won't crawl. 7 months, I don't remember the exact age. He won't crawl.
So when I was in Canada, when I went to the Columbia ice fields, when you buy the rather expensive ticket, I bless the Canadian economy in a significant way over the last few weeks. But so if you want to go up onto that glacier, and actually it's really cool to go up into that big, enormous, very unique 6-wheel vehicle to get up there. It's like something out of Lost in Space, this enormous trail. Then you go out on the glacier for a half hour and you slip and slide around, and I felt like I was back in Michigan, and it was fun and it was cool, and we took selfies and tasted the fresh glacier water and all of that. And then you go on this skywalk, which they have one over in the Grand Canyon, but they have one over this valley that's quite near to the Columbia ice fields, and you go out there and it's just disturbing. And they say, "Oh, wipe your feet before you go out there." Why? To keep the glass clean? I'd rather have it dirty because it feels troubling, And then, you're just a little nervous, perhaps, if you're afraid of heights, about walking on this glass. And that's, of course, the whole attraction of the thing. And everybody's feeling a little weird, and people are sort of playing with the danger. And then people for whom it makes nervous. I saw one couple, the boyfriend or the husband, trying to coax his beloved out onto it. But I noticed that the cement that the woman was standing on is just as much on the cantilevered steel as the very thick glass that holds her. In other words, it's just because she couldn't see that she was just as much dependent on the engineering of this place as you would see when you're standing on the glass. Well, there it is. We see meaning
all across that piece of glass.
Right.
He doesn't see cliff and infer falling off place. He sees falling off place. And there's a condition called neglect.
Okay, now that's just it. He sees falling off. Now, we're not conscious of that because in some ways this seeing is pre-conscious. And in the case of these severely impaired twins, they're just seeing. That's all they're doing. And they can or cannot see the God, and he cannot see his wife. He can hear his wife. He can smell his wife. He can hear he can smell the rose. He can maybe put on the glove, but the seeing, we see meaning.
Neglect, which is characteristic of certain people who have prefrontal lobe damage. It's not neglect, it's called utilization behavior.
Yeah.
And these people lose the ability not to act in the presence of a meaningful object. So if they walk down the hall and the door is open, they will go through the door. If you put a cup in front of them, they cannot stop but pick it up because they don't see cup and infer drinking. They see drinking object directly. And so even that distinction is deceptive in a very fundamental sense because it's predicated on the idea that what we see are meaningless objects and that we lay an overlay of meaning on top of that. And it's not by no means obvious at all that that's how we see.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why it's been so difficult to make machines that can see and act in the real world, because the object world is not simple. And that value structure that you're describing, that value structure, right? That is embedded in all of our perceptions in ways that we are only beginning to understand scientifically.
Poor Sam's not going to go anywhere with this.
This, as we have seen, is most dramatically shown in prosopagnosia, in which, as a consequence of a lesion in the right occipital cortex, patients become unable to recognize faces as such and have to employ an elaborate, absurd, and indirect route involving a bit-by-bit analysis of meaningless and separate features. So it seems to be with those who love numbers. These too become recognizable as such in a single, intuitive, personal, I know you. The mathematician Wim Klein has put this well. Numbers are friends for me, more or less. It doesn't mean the same for you, does it? 3,844? For you it's just a 3 and an 8 and a 4 and a 4. But I say hi, 62 squared. I believe the twins, seemingly so isolated, live in a world full of friends, that they have millions, billions of numbers to which they say hi, and which, I am sure, say hi back. But none of the numbers is arbitrary, like 62 squared. Nor, and this is the mystery, is it arrived at by any of the usual methods or any method so far as I can make out. The twins seem to employ a direct cognition, like angels. They see directly a universe and heaven of numbers.
No, very subtle. They see directly. Well, there's a biblical reference in there. Then we'll see him face to face. Well, we can't see him. Well, why can't we see God? Well, God is a super thing in the sky. Why? Show me this God. Well, show me your numbers. Well, I can stack up cups and say there are 3 cups. Are you seeing 3? How exactly is any of this working?
And this, however singular, however bizarre, but what right have we to call it pathological, provides a singular self-sufficiency and serenity to their lives, and one which it might be tragic to interfere with or break. This serenity was in fact interrupted and broken up 10 years later, when it was felt that the twins should be separated for their own good.
Should be separated for their own good. What goal do we see that they must strive for? What thing ought they? Well, they are a burden. They are a burden on the state, or a burden on their family, or a burden on the state of New York.
To prevent their unhealthy communication together, and in order that they could come out and face the world in an appropriate, socially acceptable way, as the medical and sociological jargon had it.
Now we begin to see the machine.
They were separated then in 1977, with results that might be considered as either gratifying or dire. Both have been moved now into halfway houses and do menial jobs for pocket money under close supervision. They are able to take buses, if carefully directed and given a token, and to keep themselves moderately presentable and clean, though their moronic and psychotic character is still recognizable at a glance. This is the positive side. But there is a negative side too, not mentioned in their charts, because it was never recognized in the first place. Deprived of their numerical communion with each other, and of time and opportunity for any contemplation or communion at all, they are always being hurried and jostled from one job to another. They seem to have lost their strange numerical power.
They no longer worship. They no longer go to their little church of two that Oliver Sacks was a visitor in, where they could contemplate the vision of the prime numbers. They now have, there's another story in this wonderful little book where a man finally pleads, I need to go to church, and then he goes to church, and he's got all of Bach in his head, and he knows exactly when they should, and he helps this little church in New York that follows Bach, helps them get it all exactly right. But to the rest of the world, he's an idiot. So now these two, well, now they can take a bus. Now they can sweep a floor if they don't bother anybody too much.
And with this the chief joy and sense of their lives. But this is considered a small price to pay, no doubt, for their having become quasi-independent and socially acceptable. One is reminded somewhat of the treatment meted out to Nadia, an autistic child with a phenomenal gift for drawing. Nadia, too, was subjected to a therapeutic regime to find ways in which her potentialities in other directions could be maximized. The net effect was that she started talking and stopped drawing. Nigel Dennis comments, "We are left with a genius who has had her genius removed, leaving nothing behind but a general defectiveness." What are we supposed to think about such a curious cure? It should be added, this is a point dwelt on by F.W.H. Myers, whose consideration of number prodigies opens his chapter on genius, that the faculty is strange and may disappear spontaneously, though it is, as often, lifelong. In the case of the twins, of course, it was not just a faculty, but the personal and emotional center of their lives. And now they are separated. Now it is gone. There is no longer any sense or center to their lives. On the other hand, should this discussion be thought too singular or perverse, it is important to note that in the case of the twins studied by Luria, their separation was essential for their own development, unlocked them from a meaningless and sterile babble and bind, and permitted them to develop as healthy and creative people.
I pulled up and edited the story of the twins to realize that I'm wearing the same shirt as I wore when I made that video. My beard's about the same length. I could pull this off and maybe fool some of you to think that it's the same video, except there's an annoying hum in that video, which kind of annoyed me and drove me a little crazy. And then, of course, he goes into schizophrenia, which is of an interest of mine because now I know a fair number of people who've been diagnosed as bipolar. I know a fair number of people who've been diagnosed with depression. I know a fair number of people who have not been formally diagnosed, but probably are a bit depressed. But the schizophrenics are a very interesting group because in many ways, the narrative and the association are not sort of checked both by the lower register and then by the community. So they're kind of a special example of this.
Topic. I mean, I'd love to talk to you about schizophrenia. What is schizophrenia from your research and from your general understanding, and what is the full landscape of suffering and wisdom that schizophrenia explores?
Schizophrenia is a state where there's a break from reality, and so this can show up as we call them the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. These include hallucinations, hearing something or seeing something that's not there, usually auditory hallucinations. Paranoia, people can have complex fears. Delusions, which we call fixed false beliefs. People get an extremely unshakable but completely implausible idea about something. Sometimes it relates to themselves, sometimes to the world. These we call the positive symptoms, break from reality as we know it. Then there are the negative symptoms that come with it, and these are progressive. These are flattening of emotion, as we call it, so starting to express less and less positive emotion, ending more in a neutral or flat state. Thought disorder, inability to work with complex patterns of planning or thinking, so you can't make plans, you have poor working memory, you can't keep track of where you were in a conversation.
That's a fascinating aspect. This difficulty of tracking. We talked before about how sort of people who are highly social can sort of have in old modem terms, the baud rate, the high bandwidth, and they're working all sorts of models behind them. They're mapping the person, they're mapping themselves, they're mapping the interaction, they're doing all this stuff, just zip, 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 zip. Autism, where they're just sort of they're managing a stable world, and so they can kind of sit back and manage the stable world. And now schizophrenia is in terms of tracking
in a sequence of actions. So poor and impaired working with the thoughts of oneself, and then these positive symptoms of break from reality. Okay, now why do these come together? What's the neurobiology of it? Again, we don't know. Schizophrenia, extremely genetically determined. If you look at the numbers, could be upwards of 80% genetically determined.
Oh, wow.
1%.
And that's a big one.
Of the human population around the world. It's universal. Okay, it's not confined to any one culture. Not even really biased in one culture or another. About 1% around the world, and has this progressive quality to it, untreated. So it's very interesting. There's a break that happens. We call it first break, when someone experiences their first disruption of reality. They can have a completely typical life up until that point. So you might have and I've seen, just heartbreaking cases of like this in the Stanford emergency room, where a kid who's come there who's been extremely, high functioning in that sense of academic achievement and athletic and interpersonal, and then comes to college. Usually in men, it's around 18, 19 when the first break happens. Some terrifying paranoia hits, or some auditory hallucinations start. They're getting screamed at by a voice in their head. So devastating. With women, comes on also often a little later, sometimes in the 20s. And it can be progressive. If it's not treated, it just progresses and progresses. The voices become overwhelming. The delusions and paranoia extend and expand. The negative symptoms particularly become more and more severe. So one can't even maintain thoughts in any sort of ordered fashion. And then eventually, it can be fatal. It can lead to suicide. It can lead to erratic behavior that leads to accidents. Now, it can be treated. There are medications that help. Fortunately, they have side effects, so they're not perfect. You can have movement problems and actually a whole host of different side effects that come from them.
I remember we had one woman in the church who had in the church for years. When she died, I did her funeral, and I hadn't had a chance to meet her brother, and her brother had all sorts of stories about how he'd take her camping or hiking, and she'd always be looking up because the government is watching her from the planes. He would talk to her about how on certain medications she would sort of get stuck. And he talked about that. That was just fascinating to me.
The medications, but we can help people now with schizophrenia very, very significantly. But the amazing thing, and this is emblematic of where psychiatry stands, we don't have the deep understanding. Just like with depression, we don't have that heart as a pump level of understanding that we'd like to have with schizophrenia, despite it being so biological, so genetic in its nature.
So is there a way, once a way to return to the other side of the first break. So when you have a break with reality, is there a way to kind of stitch it together?
Yeah. So some people that works, but we don't really know how. So medications, antipsychotic medications, we call them, they block a particular neurotransmitter receptor called the serotonin 2A receptor, and they modulate dopamine as well and other neurotransmitters. These can take someone who's actively hallucinating, actively paranoid, put them back in a completely normal state, and some people stay that way indefinitely. And so you can bring people back from that back to the other side, have it stitched together. More typically, you'll end up in some intermediate state where symptoms are reduced powerfully, but there might be still something there, and you've got a drop down in functioning that may be persistent for a while. But concepts, what physically is going on. One idea is that it's communication within the brain. One part of the brain is not able to tell other parts of the brain what it's doing. And so the auditory hallucinations are...
Now he has a very interesting section here. Let's see, where is it at the end? Oh, yeah. Because a lot of this is very Peugeotian. The multiplicity within becomes a coherent whole. And schizophrenia is a difficulty of the multiplicity and the coherence. A little bit later, he's going to talk to Lex, and I'm running out of time. He's going to talk to Lex about, if you could distribute his neurons over space, would that be him? Really interesting thought experiment towards the end of the conversation. And it has everything to do with connections and the nature of these connections and the quality of these connections. And again, to me, that sort of leads us into this conversation about collective, again, Vivek will talk about collective cognition. And civilization is in some ways a massive collective cognition machine. And it can go very well and it can go very poorly. And it's massive in that some aspects might be going very well or better and other aspects might be going poorly. But again, all of that evaluation has to do with a telos, an endpoint, what we think the straight stick is, what we think the final destination is, what is life as it's supposed to live. And this is and we do this collectively. We don't do it individually. Don't do it individually inside of us in terms of individual neurons, and we don't do it individually in terms of with each other. And sanity, sane, sanitarium, sanitary. I mean, it's all about, again, these are hyper-therapeutic words, but it's all about shalom. It's all about the whole. It's all about the ideal. It's all about arriving. It's all about achieving. And that, so then, okay, is Ye, get his name right, Kanye, is Ye sane? Somebody on Twitter again was, Jordan Peterson is unbalanced. Okay, well, is Jordan Peterson sane? Well, how sane? Well, his sanity has everything to do also with where he is in the social matrix. So, sanity, collective cognition. But this time, the Deisseroth edition. Now, I've just started his book. It'll be interesting to find out what I learned from his book, probably more than just what was on Lex Fridman. I'm out of time. Time to land the plane. Leave a comment. Thanks for watching.